April 2nd, 1882. Sunday morning in Manhattan. The Glenham Hotel on Fifth Avenue rests in the peculiar quiet that precedes the city's awakening, its corridors thick with the residual smoke of Saturday night cigars and the sulphurous tang of gaslight that never quite dissipates. It is 9:30. Outside, carriage wheels begin their rhythmic clatter against cobblestones, carrying the devout to Trinity Church and the prosperous to their social obligations. But on the third floor of this respectable, if somewhat fading establishment, the world has contracted to the space between a heavy oak door and a tragedy that will redefine the meaning of dynastic failure. The chambermaid moves through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, her footsteps muffled by carpeting that has absorbed decades of whispered confessions and desperate schemes. She reaches room 35, balances her tray, and knocks. The silence that answers is not the ordinary quiet of sleep or early departure. It possesses a density, a weight that seems to press against the door from within. She turns the key. The lock tumbles with a metallic click that echoes too loudly in the hallway, and she steps into a chamber where the curtains remain drawn against the spring sun, where the air hangs stagnant with the scent of laudanum and defeat. What she discovers there is not merely death, it is historical impossibility made manifest. Lying slumped against silk pillows embroidered with the hotel's modest monogram is a man of 51 years, his body angled awkwardly as if caught in the middle of a final, desperate thought. His face, framed by dark whiskers now disheveled against the pillowcase, drains rapidly of the color that defines the living. His right hand rests near his temple, fingers still curled around the cold blue steel of a Smith & Wesson revolver, nickel-plated, the kind of weapon a gentleman might carry for protection during evening walks through questionable neighborhoods. The entry wound is small, almost apologetic, positioned just above his right ear. The bullet has done its work with mechanical obedience, though the human beings in this story have proven far less reliable. The man in the bed is Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, second son of the richest man in America, heir to a railroad empire worth over $100 million. And he has died alone, in a rented room, with less than $20 in his pocket. The room itself speaks of faded gentility rather than dynastic grandeur. The Glenham is respectable, certainly, but not resplendent, not what one would expect of a Vanderbilt sanctuary. Its patterned wallpaper bears the subtle stains of time. Its heavy damask curtains have absorbed decades of tobacco smoke and whispered secrets, and the Persian rug shows wear patterns from the pacing of desperate men. On the nightstand sits a half-empty bottle of laudanum, its amber contents catching what little morning light filters through the drawn curtains. Beside it, a crystal tumbler still bearing the ghost of last night's brandy. The breakfast tray the maid expected to find remains outside the door, untouched, the coffee long since gone cold. But it is the debris of a life systematically dismantled that tells the true story. On the writing desk near the window, investigators will later catalog the evidence of his final hours. 3 letters, sealed but not yet posted. One addressed to his brother William Henry Vanderbilt, the favored son who inherited their father's empire and his contempt for weakness. One to his sister, who had long since stopped answering his correspondence. And one to his attorney, containing instructions for the disposal of what little remained of his estate after a lifetime of spectacular self-destruction. The handwriting grows progressively more unsteady across the pages, suggesting either the effects of the laudanum or the trembling that sometimes preceded his epileptic seizures, the condition that had marked him as defective in his father's eyes from childhood. Scattered throughout the room are other artifacts of a life that never quite cohered into a meaningful whole, racing forms from the Saratoga track, where he had lost fortunes with the same casual inevitability that other men lose buttons, a daguerreotype of his mother, dead now for nearly 2 decades, her face bearing the same haunted exhaustion that would eventually consume her son, a stack of unpaid bills from tailors and wine merchants, and the kind of establishments that extend credit to Vanderbilts even when they know, with absolute certainty, that this particular Vanderbilt will never pay. Tucked into the mirror frame, a newspaper clipping from 1879, the announcement of his settlement with the family, the $400,000 he had wrested from his brother through sheer desperation and the threat of public scandal. $400,000 in 1879, a sum so vast it could have purchased a fleet of ships, a block of Manhattan real estate, a lifetime of security and respect. 3 years later, it has evaporated into the ether of bad investments and worse companions, of gambling debts and the endless, futile attempt to purchase the one thing money could never buy him, acceptance into the family that shared his blood, but never his suffering. When the police arrive, their boots heavy on the carpet, their voices low and clipped, they begin the grim inventory of the dead man's possessions. They search the pockets of his silk dressing gown, a garment that must have cost more than the maid earns in 6 months. They open the drawers of the nightstand. What they find is a testament to the cruelest mathematics of the Gilded Age. No deeds to grand estates, no railroad bonds worth millions, no evidence of the vast machinery of wealth that bears his surname. Only a gold watch, a few personal letters, and less than $20 in cash. The heir to the greatest dynasty the United States has ever produced has died with barely enough currency to pay for his own coffin. The contradiction is so sharp, it feels like a physical wound. His father built fortresses of steel that could move mountains and tame rivers. The Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt I, had conquered nature itself, carving railroads through granite mountains and bridging uncrossable rivers. His steamships defied storms that sent other vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. He accumulated wealth so staggering that newspapers struggled to find metaphors adequate to describe it, transforming himself from Staten Island ferryman to master of American commerce through sheer will and ruthless calculation. But all that power, all those thousands of miles of iron track, all those locomotives thundering across a continent, couldn't save his own son from the enemy that lived within these gilded walls. The dynasty itself. The Vanderbilt name, which opened every door in America, had been for Cornelius Jeremiah the heaviest chain ever forged. It promised everything and delivered nothing. It whispered of birthright while delivering only exile. It was both his only currency and the reason he could never earn anything honestly, because every transaction was shadowed by the question, are they dealing with the man or merely the name? In the adjacent room, a man named George Terry stands in the hallway, his face gray with shock. He had been Cornelius's companion, his friend, the witness to these final hours. He tells the officers that Cornelius had knocked on his door just moments before the end, complaining of a headache, looking into Terry's eyes with a gaze that was both terrified and strangely resigned. "I am tired of life," he had whispered. Terry had dismissed it as melancholy, the temporary despair of a rich man's mood. He had not understood that for Cornelius Jeremiah, despair was not a mood, it was an inheritance, passed down through generations of dynastic cruelty as surely as stock certificates or railroad bonds. The question isn't how he died. The mechanics of suicide are brutally simple: a moment of resolve, a squeeze of the trigger, and the problem of existence is solved with the finality of a ledger balanced. The question is, how does a Vanderbilt become so forgotten, so expendable, that suicide feels like the only door left unlocked? How does the son of America's richest man die alone in a hotel room with less cash in his pockets than the doorman who will carry his body to the morgue? How does a name that appears on the mastheads of railroads and steamship lines become so thoroughly erased that his own brother will not attend his funeral? This death, this final act of defiance or surrender, or perhaps both, was not a sudden impulse, but the inevitable conclusion of a life spent in the shadow of a father who confused strength with cruelty, legacy with love, Dynasty with family. The tragedy of Room 35 is not epilepsy or gambling or forgery. It is the slow, psychological murder committed over decades by a family that treated wealth as armor and weakness as betrayal. Cornelius Jeremiah had spent his entire existence trying to buy the affection of a ghost, trying to prove to a dead father that he was worthy of the name he bore. On this Sunday morning, he finally realized the game was rigged. The gas lamps flicker against mahogany walls yellowed by decades of secrets. The maid weeps softly in the corridor, terrified by her proximity to such scandalous death. The police cover the body with a sheet, hiding the face of the black sheep from the world that never wanted to look at him in the first place. Outside, the noise of the city grows louder, the rhythm of commerce and ambition churning on, indifferent to the life that has just been extinguished. But we cannot leave him here, cannot let this story end with the gunshot, because the gunshot is merely the punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. To understand that morning, the stale scent of defeat that permeates this room, the cold weight of that revolver as he lifted it to his temple, the terrible silence that followed the report, we must return to 1830, to the moment Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt was born into a family that would spend 50 years teaching him he was unwanted. We must witness the construction of the trap before we can understand the creature caught within it, because the gilded cage was not built in a day. It was forged, bar by bar, insult by insult, rejection by rejection, by the one man who should have held the key to his freedom. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt entered the world on December 29, 1830, second son of a man who was rapidly transforming from mere mortal into something closer to a geologic force. His father was Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, a colossus who had already begun his metamorphosis from Staten Island ferry captain with calloused hands and limited literacy into the master of America's waterways. The child's first cries echoed through rooms that would soon be replaced by marble halls, announcing a life destined to unfold in the lengthening shadow of American ambition at its most ruthless and spectacular. By the time Jeremiah drew his first breath, his father controlled significant portions of New York's rivers and harbors, his steamships cutting through the water like iron predators. By the time he spoke his first words, his father was laying the iron foundations that would eventually bind a fractured continent into a single, exploitable market. The Vanderbilt name was becoming synonymous with empire, with the kind of self-made supremacy that America celebrated in its mythology, even as it feared the concentration of such devastating power. But empires, as Jeremiah would learn through 50 years of agonizing repetition, have no patience for fragile heirs. They demand strength, ruthlessness, the ability to crush opposition without hesitation or remorse. They require sons who can look at a competitor's ruin and feel only satisfaction, who can hear the word mercy and understand it as weakness. Jeremiah possessed none of these qualities, and his father would never forgive him for it. To understand the trap into which Cornelius Jeremiah was born, one must first confront the magnitude of the man who set it. The Commodore was not born to wealth or privilege. He was forged in the crucible of early American capitalism, where survival required constant vigilance against a world that gave nothing freely. He seized wealth through calculated violence and iron discipline, understanding instinctively that American commerce in the early 19th century was not a gentleman's game, but a war conducted by other means. He began his commercial career at 16 with a small sailing vessel, ferrying passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. What distinguished him from dozens of other young boatmen was not superior seamanship or better equipment, but an absolute willingness to destroy anyone who stood between him and dominance. He crushed competitors like insects, undercutting their prices until they faced bankruptcy, then purchasing their vessels for pennies on the dollar. He bribed legislators with the casual efficiency of a man buying vegetables at market, understanding that laws were simply another commodity to be acquired and deployed strategically. He accumulated vessels, then railroads, then political influence, until his personal fortune rivaled the treasuries of European kingdoms. The transformation was ruthless and complete. The Staten Island boatman became master of the harbor, then the rivers, then the coastlines themselves. By the 1850s, he had become a mythic figure, the embodiment of American industrial might, a man who could tame rivers and carve railroads through granite mountains through sheer force of will. His philosophy was brutally simple and consistently applied. The strong devoured the weak, the worthy inherited the earth, and sentiment was the luxury of men who could afford to lose. He viewed the world through a lens of Darwinian absolutism decades before Darwin would give that worldview scientific vocabulary. Competition was not merely economic, it was existential, a test of fundamental fitness that separated those destined to command from those destined to serve or perish. He applied this philosophy to business rivals, to political opponents, to social inferiors, and with tragic consistency, to his own children. Into this citadel of masculine aggression and ruthless pragmatism, Cornelius Jeremiah was born, a soft-featured, anxious anomaly in a bloodline of predators. From his earliest years, it was clear that he did not possess the requisite hardness to survive in his father's ecosystem. While the Commodore was a creature of physical vitality, a man who seemed carved from the same granite as Manhattan bedrock, Jeremiah was delicate, prone to fits of nerves, to hesitation, to a sensitivity that his father viewed not as a personality trait, but as a structural defect in the family. Architecture. His firstborn son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited the Commodore's ruthless pragmatism along with his sharp features and calculating gaze. William understood instinctively what his father required: absolute obedience, coupled with demonstrated competence, the ability to manage vast commercial enterprises without troubling the Commodore with details or, worse, with failure. William was methodical where his father was instinctive, cautious where his father was bold. But he possessed the essential quality that would eventually make him heir. He was strong in the ways that mattered to the Commodore: mentally resilient, emotionally armored, capable of making decisions. That ruined thousands of lives without losing sleep or appetite. But the true fissure in the relationship between father and second son, the crack in the armor that would never be repaired, revealed itself in childhood. Jeremiah was epileptic. In the mid-19th century, epilepsy was not merely a medical diagnosis, it was a profound social stigma, a condition shrouded in superstition and shame. The seizures themselves were terrifying spectacles: the sudden loss of consciousness, the rigid convulsions, the foaming at the mouth, the eventual collapse into exhausted confusion. To a man like the Commodore, who prided himself on absolute control over his environment, his business, and his body, seeing his own son seized by convulsions, helpless and thrashing on drawing-room floors, was a source of visceral revulsion. It was an affront to the Vanderbilt brand of invincibility, a daily reminder that some things could not be controlled, that his genetic legacy contained flaws. The Commodore did not see a child suffering from a neurological disorder. He saw a broken machine, evidence that his own potent blood had somehow curdled in transmission to the next generation. In the Vanderbilt citadel, epilepsy was not merely an illness, it was a moral failing, a crack in the family armor that threatened the dynasty's carefully constructed facade of invincibility. Jeremiah's seizures were not medical episodes, they were public embarrassments, proof that the Vanderbilt bloodline had produced a defect. The psychological architecture of the Vanderbilt household was designed to produce a very specific kind of heir, one who understood that affection was earned through achievement, that love was conditional upon demonstrated utility, that family was not a sanctuary but a proving ground. William thrived in this environment because his temperament, aligned with its demands. He was given increasing responsibility in the family's business operations, learning the intricate machinery of steamship management and railroad finance at his father's side. He attended important meetings, witnessed negotiations, absorbed the brutal lessons of commercial warfare. Jeremiah withered because he possessed neither the constitution nor the inclination to become the kind of son his father required. He was increasingly marginalized, excluded from the family business, not through explicit decree, but through the more subtle mechanism of never being invited, never being considered, never being treated as someone whose opinion or participation mattered. When he spoke, he was often ignored. When he had an opinion, it was ridiculed. The father's rejection was total and consuming, not merely the absence of love, but active regret for his existence. Desperate for approval, or perhaps simply desperate to feel something other than shame, Jeremiah began to act out. If he could not command his father's respect through business acumen, he would command attention through scandal. He discovered that while he lacked his father's talent for making money, he possessed a terrifying talent for spending it. He began to frequent the gambling dens of New York, finding temporary anesthesia in the turn of cards and the spin of wheels. In those dimly lit rooms, surrounded by sycophants and sharks, the name Vanderbilt bought him instant status. It didn't matter that he was the fit son, the disappointment. His surname was currency. The Commodore watched this descent with a mixture of fury and validation. Jeremiah's gambling debts, his dissolute lifestyle, his inability to hold down the clerk positions his father grudgingly arranged, all of it served to confirm the Commodore's original hypothesis: the boy was worthless. The father's philosophy became self-fulfilling prophecy. He withheld love, creating a vacuum that his son tried to fill with vice, which in turn justified the decision to withhold love. It was a cycle of destruction that spun as reliably as the wheels of the Commodore's locomotives. By the late 1840s, as Jeremiah entered his late teens, the pattern of his life was crystallizing. He drifted toward the kind of dissipated company that aristocratic young men often kept when they possessed famous names, but no meaningful purpose. He learned that he could trade on his father's reputation, even as that father systematically denied him any legitimate role in the family enterprise. Each failure confirmed the Commodore's assessment. Each scandal validated his decision to treat his second son as expendable. The Commodore believed in Darwinian absolutes. The strong devoured the weak, the worthy inherited the earth, and sons who could not command respect commanded nothing. By 1850, when Jeremiah was barely 20 years old, his father had made his judgment explicit and immutable. His second son would receive nothing of consequence: no position in the family business, no meaningful allowance, no financial security that would allow him to establish an independent life with dignity. The Commodore believed he was teaching a lesson about self-reliance, about proving one's worth through achievement rather than inheritance. What he actually created was something far more dangerous: a desperate young man with a famous name, no legitimate prospects, and a growing understanding that the only way to extract anything from his family was through manipulation, scandal, or outright fraud. The irony would have been apparent to anyone less convinced of his own righteousness. By denying Jeremiah any legitimate path to security or respect, the Commodore guaranteed that his son would pursue illegitimate ones. By treating him as defective and expendable, he created the very monster he claimed to fear, a Vanderbilt who would use the family name as a weapon against the family itself. The Commodore thought he was pruning a dead branch from the family tree. In reality, he was creating a saboteur, teaching Jeremiah that the only way to survive in a world of predators was to become one himself. He was stripping away the boy's dignity and leaving him with nothing but a famous name and a burning need for vindication. The golden era of the Vanderbilt dynasty was dawning, bathed in the light of immense fortune and industrial progress. But in the shadows of that blinding success, Cornelius Jeremiah was learning a different trade entirely. He wasn't learning how to build railroads. He was learning how to derail them. But cutting off a desperate heir is like damming a river. The water will not simply disappear. It will build pressure in the darkness, searching for cracks in the bedrock, accumulating weight and force, until the dam can no longer contain it. The water will find another way through, carving new channels, eroding foundations, eventually breaking free with destructive power that dwarfs the original flow. Jeremiah's way, the path he would carve through the next 3 decades, would involve forgery, fraud, public scandal, and a legal battle that would threaten to split the entire citadel in 2. And the Commodore, for all his genius at conquering external enemies, would prove helpless against the adversary he had created within his own bloodline. In 1850, Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt committed the unforgivable sin. He embarrassed his father in public. The transgression occurred not in some back-alley gambling den or disreputable tavern, but in the gilded sanctuary of Delmonico's restaurant, where the Commodore had assembled a carefully curated audience of railroad investors and political operatives to witness what should have been a display of dynastic succession. Instead, they witnessed its spectacular failure. The evening had begun with the familiar choreography of power. Crystal glasses caught the gaslight like captured stars, silverware gleamed against white linen, and conversations flowed between courses with the practiced ease of men who understood that dinner was merely another battlefield where fortunes were won and lost. Jeremiah, then 20 years old, sat at the periphery of his father's circle, permitted rather than welcomed, his presence a reluctant concession to the fiction that the Vanderbilt dynasty possessed depth beyond its singular founder. The seizure announced itself with cruel timing, arriving just as the Commodore was holding forth on the future of American railroads. First came the familiar warning signs that only Jeremiah recognized, the metallic taste flooding his mouth, the sense of unreality creeping across his vision like fog rolling off the harbor. Then his body betrayed him with the mechanical precision that characterized all his failures. His chair tipped backward as his muscles seized, sending a wineglass crashing to the marble floor in a spray of crimson that looked disturbingly like blood. His limbs jerked in grotesque rhythm, his jaw clenched until his teeth threatened to shatter, his breathing strangled into desperate gasps. The assembled titans of industry watched in fascinated horror as the heir to America's greatest transportation empire thrashed helplessly on the polished parquet floor. These were men who faced down financial panics with icy composure, who orchestrated the ruin of competitors without losing sleep, who treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of progress. But the sight of a body in open revolt against itself, a flesh that refused to obey the commands of will, struck them with primitive terror. Someone muttered a prayer. Someone else crossed himself. A servant rushed forward, then hesitated, unsure whether to touch the convulsing figure or maintain respectful distance from what might be contagious madness. The Commodore rose slowly from his chair, his face carved from granite, his steel gray eyes calculating not his son's suffering, but the damage to his carefully constructed reputation. He did not kneel beside the thrashing figure. He did not offer comfort or reassurance. Instead, he surveyed the faces around the table with the cold assessment of a general counting casualties after battle. The Vanderbilt citadel had been breached not by business rivals or political enemies, but by the fundamental weakness of its own bloodline. When the seizure finally ended, as they always did, with the cruel parody of exhausted peace, Jeremiah lay still against the restaurant's expensive carpet, breathing shallowly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He tried to sit up, to apologize, to somehow smooth over the humiliation with words that would not come. His tongue felt heavy, his mind thick with the neurological fog that always followed these episodes. He looked up at his father's polished shoes, planted inches from his face, and saw in the Commodore's eyes not concern or compassion, but only contempt. The dinner resumed eventually, conversation forced back into motion through sheer social necessity and the collective pretense that nothing unforgivable had occurred. But in the parlors and drawing rooms of New York's elite, the whispers had already begun. The mad Vanderbilt heir, the Fitz son. The defective branch of America's mightiest family tree. For a man who had built his empire on the projection of invincibility, who understood that reputation was as valuable as rolling stock, the damage was intolerable. Coinciding with this public humiliation came another revelation that transformed embarrassment into crisis. Jeremiah's gambling debts had begun arriving at the Commodore's office like poisoned pen letters. Heavy envelopes bearing the Vanderbilt name and demanding immediate settlement for sums that staggered even seasoned financiers. The son, systematically excluded from legitimate access to the family fortune, had been creating illegitimate access through promissory notes and borrowed prestige. He had been trading on the dynasty's credit not to build empire, but to feed private vices that multiplied in the darkness of his exclusion. The Commodore's response was swift, merciless, and terrifyingly bureaucratic. He did not seek rehabilitation for his troubled son, for he did not believe in cures for fundamental weakness. Instead, he sought containment. With strategic precision, he assembled a conspiracy of physicians whose careers depended on Vanderbilt patronage and whose diagnoses aligned conveniently with his requirements. The commitment papers they signed condemned Jeremiah to Bloomingdale Insane Asylum, that stone fortress of madness perched on the heights of Upper Manhattan, where the unwanted children of America's elite were warehoused behind high walls and barred windows. Understand this fundamental truth: Jeremiah was not insane. He was inconvenient. In the mid-19th century, the line between neurological disorder and lunacy was dangerously thin, often drawn by medical authorities whose opinions could be purchased as easily as railroad bonds or legislative votes. Epilepsy was not understood as electrical misfiring in the brain, but as a terrifying disruption of the soul, a physical manifestation of moral corruption or divine disfavor. To the medical establishment of 1850, the seizures that left Jeremiah senseless and thrashing were indistinguishable from the violent outbursts of the genuinely deranged. The asylum became his father's weapon of choice, a way to scrub the stain of imperfection from the Vanderbilt escutcheon while maintaining the fiction of paternal concern. Bloomingdale Insane Asylum was a Gothic monument to society's capacity for organized cruelty, its stone walls seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the impression of a structure that existed partially outside normal space and time. The building's barred windows stared out at the Hudson River like dead eyes, offering inmates glimpses of a world they could observe, but no longer touch. Within those walls, the asylum operated on principles that were medieval in their brutality despite their scientific pretensions. Patients were subjected to cold baths meant to shock madness from their systems, force-fed tonics of bromide and arsenic that poisoned the body while claiming to heal the mind, and restrained with heavy leather straps during episodes that were treated not as medical events, but as moral failures, requiring correction. For Jeremiah, the experience was a peculiar form of torture precisely because he was not mad. He understood with perfect clarity that his imprisonment was not medical but strategic, not therapeutic but punitive. His seizures, which the asylum doctors treated as manifestations of spiritual corruption requiring divine intervention, continued with their usual unpredictable frequency. But between the episodes, his mind remained sharp, calculating, increasingly consumed by a cold rage that had nowhere to go except inward, where it began to crystallize into something harder and more dangerous than simple anger. The corridors of Bloomingdale echoed with the constant, rhythmic screaming of patients lost to syphilis or melancholia, a dissonant soundtrack to his confinement. The air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid, boiled cabbage, and unwashed bodies. The olfactory signature of institutional despair. He was stripped of his fine clothes, his dignity, and his autonomy, reduced to a patient number and a diagnosis that served political rather than medical purposes. When he demanded to see his father, the staff noted delusions of grandeur in his file. When he wept for his freedom, they prescribed isolation and increased doses of the chemicals that dulled his mind while sharpening his hatred. In the solitude of his cell, Jeremiah began to write letters. Dozens of them, hundreds eventually, scratching out pleas for release on the coarse paper the asylum provided. He wrote to his mother Sophia, begging her to intervene, receiving in response only vague promises and maternal hand-wringing that changed nothing. He wrote to his brother William, appealing to fraternal loyalty that had never existed, receiving nothing but silence. He wrote to family friends, to distant relatives, to anyone who might possess the influence or courage to challenge the Commodore's decree. The letters disappeared into the void of institutional bureaucracy or were intercepted by administrators who understood that their Vanderbilt funding came with implicit instructions about which correspondence should reach the outside world. "I am not mad, Father," he wrote in one desperate missive, the ink blotted with tears. "I am only your son." These words, like all the others, vanished into the machinery of his erasure, answered only by the terrible silence that taught him more about his father's true nature than any conversation ever could. But as the months stretched into a year, the despair began to harden into something else entirely. The asylum was meant to break him, to crush his spirit until he became a docile, invisible invalid who would no longer trouble the great Commodore's carefully constructed narrative. Instead, the confinement gave him time to think, to understand the true nature of his relationship with his father. This was not punishment for gambling or public embarrassment. It was an attempt at erasure. The Commodore was not trying to fix him. He was trying to delete him from the family story entirely. Within those walls, something crystallized in Jeremiah's mind, not the chaotic madness the doctors claimed to treat, but a focused, obsessive clarity centered on vindication. He realized that his father had used the law as a weapon, manipulating statutes and medical opinions to suit his will. If the legal system could be bent by money and influence, perhaps it could also be broken by scandal and public exposure. He began to understand that the Vanderbilt name, which had been the key to his cell, was also the only weapon he possessed. The hypocrisy of his situation became blindingly clear. The Commodore had built his empire on ruthlessness, on bending rules, on destroying enemies who threatened his interests. By locking Jeremiah away, the father had unwittingly taught the son the most important lesson of the Vanderbilt creed: survival justifies any tactic. The asylum stripped away the last vestiges of filial loyalty and replaced them with strategic thinking. Why should he protect the reputation of a man who had consigned him to Bedlam? Why should he honor a name that had been used to sign his death warrant? When his release finally came, it arrived not through paternal mercy, but through the intersection of legal technicalities and external pressure. His mother, Sophia, horrified by what her husband had done and perhaps beginning to understand the true nature of the man she had married, had quietly consulted attorneys who discovered procedural irregularities in the commitment process. The physicians had not conducted proper examinations. The legal notifications had not been properly served. Questions were being asked by reformers and journalists who had taken interest in the American prince locked away in a dungeon. The Commodore, calculating as always, recognized that a public legal battle over his son's sanity would generate exactly the kind of scandal he had sought to avoid through institutionalization. The man who walked out of Bloomingdale's Gothic gates bore little resemblance to the one who had entered. Jeremiah was thinner, his eyes shadowed by the horrors he had witnessed, his hands trembling slightly from the bromide treatments that had poisoned his system. But beneath the physical frailty lay something new and terrifying, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of systematic betrayal. He had been stripped of illusions, armor, and hope, but in losing everything, he had gained a terrible kind of freedom. He could not be threatened with disinheritance because he had already been disinherited. He could not be shamed because he had already been publicly declared mad. He could not be controlled through affection because he had finally, irrevocably understood that his father was incapable of loving him. The asylum had been intended as his tomb, a place where the inconvenient second son would disappear from history. Instead, it became the forge for his rebellion. He stepped back into the Manhattan sunlight, not as a chastened son seeking reconciliation, but as an adversary who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he had nearly been one of them. The sanctuary of madness had failed to contain the problem. It had merely compressed it, turning a disappointment into a bomb. He emerged with a dangerous new understanding that would shape every decision for the next 3 decades. The Commodore had declared war on his own blood. This was not neglect or disappointment or even cruelty in the conventional sense. It was active, sustained warfare conducted through legal instruments and medical authority and the systematic destruction of a son's dignity and prospects. The father had tried to bury his son alive in Bloomingdale's stone corridors. Instead, he had created something far more dangerous, a saboteur who understood the family's vulnerabilities from the inside, who possessed nothing but the famous name and the burning need to make it mean something, even if that meaning was destruction. And wars, even family wars, especially family wars, demand casualties. The Commodore thought he had solved the problem of his second son. In reality, he had just armed him for a conflict that would consume the next 30 years and threaten to tear apart the very dynasty he had spent his life building. The question was no longer whether Jeremiah would fight back. The asylum had settled that question definitively. The only remaining question was how much damage he could inflict before the dynasty finally succeeded in erasing him completely. Freedom, for Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, came with a price that proved far more expensive than his confinement, complete financial exile. When he walked out of Bloomingdale's gates in the early 1850s, he carried with him not liberation but a more sophisticated form of imprisonment. The Commodore had arranged his son's release not out of paternal mercy, but through strategic calculation. An institutionalized son generated more scandalous attention than a merely disappointing one. The terms of this freedom were brutally elegant. Jeremiah would receive no position in the family's sprawling commercial empire, no meaningful allowance, no financial support beyond the occasional pittance dispensed with theatrical reluctance. He was expected to maintain the appearance of a Vanderbilt, while being systematically denied the resources that made such appearances possible. It was psychological torture disguised as tough love. The Commodore's way of proving his second son was as worthless as he had always claimed. Cut off from the family fortune, stripped of any legitimate prospects, Jeremiah discovered that the Vanderbilt name remained his only currency. It was a cruel paradox that would define the next 3 decades of his existence. He was the son of the richest man in America, yet he possessed less liquidity than the clerks who tallied his father's ledgers. The contradiction was so sharp it felt like a physical wound, but it also revealed an opportunity that only a desperate man would dare to exploit. And so began the most audacious confidence game in Gilded Age history, a son systematically forging his father's signature, borrowing against an inheritance that would never come, transforming himself into what the underworld would whisper about as the Prince of Counterfeit Promises. The mechanics of his survival scheme were elegant in their simplicity, terrifying in their scope. In an age before telephones, before instant verification systems, before the intricate web of financial authentication that would later protect the wealthy from such depredations, the written word reigned as the supreme instrument of trust. A letter bearing the signature of Cornelius Vanderbilt was not merely ink on paper. It was a bond backed by millions of dollars in steamships, railroads, and Manhattan real estate. Merchants, hoteliers, moneylenders, and private banks across New York had built entire business models around the Vanderbilt name. They knew the Commodore's handwriting, his terse style, his brusque phrasing. They recognized his seal. They trusted his promises more than they trusted their own instincts. Jeremiah studied his father's correspondence with the intensity of a forger and the desperation of a drowning man. His hands, trembling slightly from the lingering effects of asylum medications and his neurological condition, practiced the Commodore's aggressive penmanship until he could reproduce it with unnerving fidelity. The first forgery was almost modest, a letter requesting a small loan, a few $100s, written to a minor financier who would never dream of questioning a Vanderbilt's credit. When the money arrived, Jeremiah experienced a revelation more intoxicating than brandy. He had forced his father's empire to acknowledge him, not through affection or approval, but through financial obligation. But to view this merely as fraud would be to miss the profound psychological tragedy at play. Each forged letter was both crime and communication, a twisted way of saying to his absent father, "You may have disowned me, but I am still a Vanderbilt." The amounts grew staggering as the scheme evolved. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands, all borrowed on the promise of millions that existed only in his father's vault. Jeremiah wasn't merely stealing. He was performing a kind of dark theater, forcing his father to acknowledge him through the language the Commodore understood best. Money. Every fraudulent bill that arrived at the Vanderbilt offices was a scream for attention disguised as a business transaction, a demand to be dealt with written in the grammar of commerce. The escalation was relentless and methodical. Jeremiah frequented the dimly lit gambling dens of Lower Manhattan, places where gaslight flickered across green felt tables, and the desperate energy of men chasing fortune charged the air like electricity before a storm. There, amidst the click of roulette wheels and the snap of playing cards, he was treated like royalty. He would arrive in hired carriages, dressed in suits cut from the finest cloth, purchased on credit, naturally, and take his seat among the other aristocratic wastrels and professional gamblers. His signature became increasingly desperate in its flourish as the debts mounted, sometimes signing as Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., sometimes forging the Commodore's own jagged scrawl on letters of credit that opened vaults across the city. The forgeries became bolder, the debts more mountainous, the lies more intricate with each passing year. Jeremiah moved through New York society like a specter, present at the finest dinners when he could secure invitations, conspicuously absent from every family portrait and gathering. He haunted the banquet halls of the Gilded Age, consuming its luxuries without ever truly belonging to the feast. While his brother William Henry prospered under their father's careful tutelage, growing methodical and serious as he mastered the details of railroad finance and steamship management, Jeremiah sank deeper into a labyrinth of promissory notes, gambling debts, and the kind of desperate schemes that transform black sheep into wolves. The Commodore's reaction to this financial guerrilla warfare was volcanic in its intensity. Bills would arrive at his Washington Place offices like poison pen letters, debts for jewelry, for thoroughbred horses, for hotel suites at the finest establishments, and the old man's face would turn a terrifying shade of purple. He would roar at his clerks, tear the invoices into confetti, and declare that he would not pay a single cent. But often, he did pay, not out of paternal love, but from a fierce, protective instinct for the Vanderbilt brand. He could not allow a Vanderbilt to be dragged to debtor's prison. The scandal would reflect poorly on the credit of his railroads and steamship lines. This created a vicious cycle that trapped both father and son in an escalating war of mutual destruction. Jeremiah spent to prove he existed, the Commodore paid to prove he remained in control, and the resentment between them calcified into something harder and more permanent than simple hatred. The father's strategy was to wait his son out, to let him sink so deeply into debt and disgrace that he would either reform through desperation or disappear entirely through suicide or exile. But the strategy failed to account for Jeremiah's stubborn refusal to vanish. his understanding that his continued presence was itself a form of revenge. As the 1860s progressed into the 1870s, Jeremiah's existence became a high-wire act performed without a net. He was constantly one step ahead of bailiffs, one bad hand away from complete ruin. The stress exacerbated his epilepsy, leading to more frequent seizures, which he medicated with alcohol and laudanum, further destabilizing his judgment and deepening his spiral into the criminal underworld. He began associating with confidence men and professional hustlers who saw in the desperate heir a tool to be used against the Titan, feeding his delusions and helping him construct ever more elaborate frauds. The Commodore, meanwhile, was aging and his health failing. The question of inheritance loomed over the family like a thunderhead, and Jeremiah knew his time was running out. He intensified his efforts, showing up uninvited at the Washington Place mansion, demanding audiences that were refused, creating scenes on the sidewalk that delighted the scandal-hungry press. But the Commodore was a man who planned for every contingency, even from beyond the grave. He spent his final years fortifying his estate against the one enemy he could not crush through rate wars or stock manipulation: his own son. When Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt finally died on January 4, 1877, the reading of his will delivered the final brutal blow in a lifetime of systematic rejection. The document revealed the full extent of his posthumous cruelty. To William Henry went the bulk of the empire, over $90 million in railroad stock, real estate, and liquid assets. To various daughters and grandchildren went smaller but substantial bequests. And to Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, second son, epileptic, forger, family embarrassment, went a trust so restrictive it was essentially an insult: $200 monthly, controlled by executors who viewed him as a moral hazard, hedged with conditions that ensured he could never access the principal or use it as collateral. $200 monthly from an estate worth over $100 million. The mathematics of contempt could not have been more precisely calculated. It was enough to prevent him from starving in the streets, but not enough to live with dignity, to pay off his accumulated debts, or to escape the financial labyrinth that decades of exile had created. The trust was designed to keep him alive but powerless, visible but irrelevant, a living cautionary tale about the consequences of disappointing a dynasty. The will did more than disinherit him, it infantilized him, placing his meager allowance under the control of executors who treated him as a dangerous child. Every expense would require justification, every purchase scrutinized for evidence of vice or extravagance. The Commodore had reached out from the crypt to place a permanent collar around his son's neck, ensuring that his control would extend beyond the grave. But death, Jeremiah discovered as he sat in that reading room, surrounded by family members who would not meet his eyes, had not ended his father's cruelty. It had merely given it legal permanence. The Commodore was gone, his iron will finally stilled by mortality's democracy, yet through the careful architecture of trusts and legal restrictions, the dead father's strangling hand would continue to control the living son. The grave could not contain such concentrated contempt. It had been encoded into legal documents that would survive him by decades. As Jeremiah walked out into the cold January air, he carried with him a terrible new understanding. If he could not inherit his father's empire, he would have to steal it. The forger's gambit had failed, but the destroyer's war was about to begin. January 1878. The Surrogates Court of New York. The chamber swells beyond its intended capacity. Every wooden bench packed with bodies pressed together in winter coats that carry the smell of coal smoke and nervous perspiration. The air is thick and stagnant, charged with the electric anticipation that precedes public executions or great theatrical performances. High windows, their glass yellowed by decades of soot, cast pale winter light across a scene that is part legal proceeding, part gladiatorial spectacle. This is not merely a courtroom. It is an arena where the most private agonies of America's wealthiest family are about to be dissected for public consumption. At the plaintiff's table sits Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, 47 years old, worn by decades of systematic rejection but possessed of something his family has never seen before, the terrifying clarity of a man who has absolutely nothing left to lose. His hair has begun to gray at the temples. Deep lines etch the corners of his eyes like scars carved by disappointment, and his hands rest on a stack of legal documents with a slight tremor that might be his neurological condition or might be the laudanum he consumed for courage that morning. His suit is expensive but slightly rumpled, his collar not quite straight, but in his eyes burns a fire that transcends mere anger, a cold, focused rage that has been banked for 30 years and now roars with the oxygen of absolute desperation. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, disinherited and desperate, commits the ultimate act of filial rebellion. He sues his own family, challenging his father's will and dragging every Vanderbilt skeleton from its carefully constructed crypt into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The legal papers he has filed represent more than a dispute over inheritance. They are a declaration of total war against the dynasty that spent his lifetime trying to erase him. If he cannot have his father's love, he will settle for his father's destruction, even if that destruction must be posthumous, even if it requires tearing down everything the Commodore built. The case he constructs is audacious in its scope and devastating in its implications. Jeremiah's legal team argues that the great Cornelius Vanderbilt, the titan who built railroads through mountains and crushed competitors with mathematical precision, was mentally incompetent in his final years, his judgment corrupted by grief over his wife's death and manipulated by spiritualists, and mediums who preyed on the old man's desperate desire to communicate with the dead. They paint a picture not of the rational business genius of legend, but of a gullible old man under the thrall of charlatans, consulting the spirits of dead business rivals for stock tips, believing he was communicating with the ghost of his mother in darkened parlors. The courtroom gasps as witnesses describe seances in the Vanderbilt mansion, magnetic healers who claim to cure ailments with invisible forces, and the Commodore, the man who had tamed rivers and bound a continent with iron rails, sitting in circles holding hands with mediums, seeking supernatural guidance for earthly affairs. But the spiritualist accusations are merely the opening gambit. Jeremiah threatens to expose darker secrets, the bribes paid to judges and legislators, the stock manipulations that ruined thousands of small investors, the ruthless destruction of competitors that bordered on systematic criminality. He alleges a family conspiracy orchestrated by his brother William Henry to isolate the Commodore, to poison his mind against his second son, to ensure that the empire would pass intact rather than be divided among all the heirs. The trial becomes a cultural phenomenon, the 19th century equivalent of a reality television spectacle that captivates the nation and horrifies the old money establishment. Each day's proceedings are reported in exhaustive detail across dozens of newspapers, their headlines screaming Vanderbilt will contest, and the Commodore's ghosts on trial. The public, hungry for evidence that the rich are just as miserable and dysfunctional as everyone else, devours every sordid detail with voyeuristic hunger. Vendors hawk broadsheets outside the courthouse, reporters jostle for position at the press tables, and the Vanderbilt name, synonymous with invincibility and ruthless efficiency, is dragged through the mud of insanity pleas and supernatural seances. For the old money establishment, the trial represents something far more terrifying than family dysfunction. It threatens the fundamental architecture of inherited wealth. If the sacred principle of testamentary freedom can be challenged, if a father's will can be overturned by a disgruntled heir, then no fortune is safe, no dynasty secure. Bankers, industrialists, and railroad magnates all understand the real danger. It is not that Jeremiah might win, but that he has shown the outside world that these colossal fortunes are vulnerable from within. The case suggests that moral claims might supersede legal ones, that fathers owe their sons more than they owe their empires. Opposite Jeremiah sits William Henry Vanderbilt, the brother who inherited 95% of the Commodore's empire, looking increasingly uncomfortable as each day brings fresh revelations. William is a man who inherited his father's fortune, but not his father's ruthlessness, who craves respectability more than conquest, who finds the daily parade of family secrets excruciating. The trial is costing him not just legal fees but social capital, business relationships, and the carefully constructed fiction that the Vanderbilts are different from other robber barons, that their wealth comes with a veneer of cultural sophistication. The legal battle stretches across 18 months, consuming 1878 and bleeding into 1879. Witnesses parade through the courtroom with testimonies ranging from the credible to the absurd. Former servants describe the Commodore's visits to spiritualist Victoria Woodhull, his violent temper, his paranoid suspicions. Business associates testify about his increasing irrationality. Medical experts debate whether epilepsy is hereditary and whether Jeremiah's condition indicates broader mental deficiency in the Vanderbilt bloodline. The family's dirty laundry is aired with the methodical thoroughness of a public hanging, each revelation chipping away at the Vanderbilt brand that William has spent years trying to polish into something approaching European aristocratic dignity. For Jeremiah, the trial is vindication. For the first time in his life, people are listening to him. The lawyers treat him with respect. The reporters seek his comments. The courtroom spectators murmur when he enters. He is no longer the invisible son, the epileptic embarrassment hidden away in asylums or ignored at dinner parties. He is the protagonist of his own tragedy, the man who dared to challenge the gods of industry and demand his share of the fire. When he takes the stand, he speaks of his childhood with a precision that comes from decades of cataloging each slight, each humiliation, each moment of casual contempt. The courtroom sits in rapt silence as he transforms his personal tragedy into public testimony, weaponizing his pain against the empire that created it. The pressure on William Henry becomes unbearable as the months drag on. The trial is not just costing money, it is costing the one thing the Vanderbilts cannot buy: their dignity. The exposure of the family's internal rot threatens to destabilize their social standing and perhaps even invite regulatory scrutiny into their business practices. William realizes with growing desperation that he cannot win by fighting, because every day the trial continues is a loss for the dynasty, every revelation another crack in the facade of invincibility. Then, in March of 1879, the unthinkable happens. William Henry Vanderbilt, the richest man in the world, blinks, terrified of further scandal, exhausted by the public humiliation, calculating that the true cost of victory might be fatal to the family's most valuable asset, its reputation for unassailable strength. He offers a settlement. The defense signals a willingness to negotiate, and the terms that emerge from those secret discussions are staggering in their frankness. Jeremiah walks out of that courthouse with a settlement of over $400,000, roughly $10 million in today's currency. The money is not a monthly allowance controlled by hostile executors. It is his, fully and legally, to do with as he pleases. The legal fees are paid, the accumulated debts wiped clean, the trust fund increased to guarantee a life of luxury. By writing that check, William has admitted something that no Vanderbilt had ever acknowledged, that Cornelius Jeremiah mattered. His complaint could not be dismissed as madness. His challenge could not be crushed by silence. The $400,000 is less a financial windfall than a confession in numerical form, as if the family had been forced to translate half a century of cruelty into a specific number. He had won. The money was his. The vindication was complete. The family that had spent decades denying his worth had just paid him $400,000 to go away, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The courts had recognized his grievance as legitimate. His family had acknowledged through the only language it truly spoke, cash, that he was wronged. He had forced them to see him, to deal with him. to admit through financial settlement what they would never admit through words. But as he stands on those courthouse steps, on that cold March afternoon, breathing air that should taste like freedom, surrounded by reporters shouting questions and spectators pressing close to witness the conclusion of the spectacle, something feels profoundly wrong. The victory tastes like ashes in his mouth, metallic and bitter, leaving him with a sensation of emptiness rather than fulfillment. The settlement papers tucked under his arm represent more money than most Americans will see in 10 lifetimes. Yet as the courthouse empties and the noise of the city rushes back in, he faces a terrible realization that crashes over him with the force of physical nausea. He had spent 30 years fighting for his father's acknowledgement, constructing elaborate schemes and desperate gambits, all in service of forcing the Commodore to see him as worthy. He had defined his entire existence through opposition, through the struggle to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. The war with his family had given his life structure, purpose, and direction. It had been the fuel that kept him moving through the dark years of the asylum, the humiliation of the gambling dens, the loneliness of his exile. Every morning he had woken up with a clear enemy to fight and a clear goal to achieve. The fight against his father's rejection had been the organizing principle of his existence, the central narrative that gave meaning to every suffering, every scheme, every moment of desperate rebellion. Now, the enemy has surrendered. The goal has been achieved. The crowds begin to disperse, their appetite for scandal temporarily sated. The reporters move on to other stories, already composing narratives that will reduce his complex tragedy to simple morality tales. The spectators drift away, returning to lives that will never intersect with his again. And as the courthouse steps empty, as the March wind cuts through his expensive coat, Jeremiah understands with crystalline clarity that he has won everything and gained nothing. The war he had won was the only thing that had been keeping him alive. Without that central conflict, the Vanderbilt name becomes not a weapon, not even a shield, but a mirror reflecting back at him everything he has failed to become, everything he has destroyed in the pursuit of a father's gaze that never lingered. The settlement has given him financial independence and stripped him of narrative purpose in the same cruel stroke. He is richer than he has ever been and more alone than he has ever felt, holding papers that prove his father owed him something, but realizing with devastating clarity that it wasn't money he wanted after all. As he descends those steps slowly, his victory march feeling more like a funeral procession, he faces the terrifying prospect of living the rest of his life in the peace he fought so hard to achieve, only to discover that peace is just another word for nothingness. The ashes of his victory settle around him, gray and cold, as he hails a carriage to take him back to the empty hotel room that is the only home he has ever known. The sensory experience of this triumph is not the fanfare of trumpets, but the hollow echo of silence, the sound of a man who has finally gotten what he thought he wanted and discovered it was not what he needed. The check will clear, but his soul remains bankrupt. The family has acknowledged him through settlement, but only to finalize his erasure. The question that haunts him as he disappears into the indifferent crowd is the one he cannot answer. Now that the battle is finished, what exactly is he supposed to do with the rest of his life? Victory, Cornelius Jeremiah discovered with the slow horror of a man realizing he has been poisoned, was the cruelest joke his father had ever played on him. The $400,000 that now rested in his account, a sum vast enough to purchase fleets of carriages or entire city blocks, was supposed to be the golden key that would unlock the kingdom of respectability he had spent 3 decades seeking. He had imagined that forcing his family to pay would force them to see him, that financial restitution would somehow transmute into the emotional restoration his soul craved. Instead, with nearly $500,000 at his disposal and the legal right to call himself a vindicated Vanderbilt heir, he found himself more profoundly alone than he had been in the depths of his most desperate poverty. The money hadn't bought him respect, hadn't opened the doors he imagined would swing wide at the sound of his vindication. It had bought him a more expensive, more luxurious form of exile, a gilded cage whose bars were forged not from iron, but from the far more durable materials of irrelevance and systematic ostracism. The immediate fallout from the trial was swift and merciless, executed with the military precision of a dynasty protecting itself from internal threats. His family, humiliated by the public airing of their patriarch's supernatural consultations and their own conspiracies, closed ranks against him with the impenetrable unity of a Roman phalanx. William Henry Vanderbilt, having calculated that a settlement was cheaper than the continued corrosion of public scandal, treated the payment not as recognition of brotherhood, but as quarantine. He had not paid Jeremiah to acknowledge him as family. He had paid him to ensure that this embarrassing, unpredictable relative would never again stand up in court and drag the dynasty through the mud of public examination. The money functioned as severance pay, an expensive final goodbye from a family determined to behave as if the plaintiff in that courtroom had ceased to exist the moment the check cleared. There were no invitations to the new marble palaces rising on Fifth Avenue, no seats reserved at the family table for holidays, no acknowledgement of his existence beyond the legal minimum required by the settlement documents. The Vanderbilt citadel had been breached by his legal assault, but rather than welcome the victor inside, they had simply rebuilt their walls higher and thicker, leaving him standing in the ruins of his triumph with nowhere to go but back to the hotel rooms that had become his only sanctuary. The settlement was not an olive branch extended in reconciliation, it was a receipt for services rendered in the business of family destruction. Society, ever attuned to the shifting winds of respectability and danger, adjusted its stance toward him with the ruthless efficiency of a stock market responding to bad news. Before the trial, he had been tolerated as an amusing scandal, a cautionary anecdote whispered behind fans and over brandy. The epileptic Vanderbilt, who forged signatures and haunted gambling dens, had been a figure of gossip, certainly, but also of fascination. He gave dinner parties novelty and rumor, that subtle spice without which no Gilded Age salon felt complete. As long as he was the downtrodden victim, he was a sympathetic figure, a character in a melodrama that the wealthy could watch with detached amusement. After the trial, the tone changed with seismic finality. He was no longer merely a family embarrassment. He had become something far more terrifying, a dangerous precedent. He represented living proof that even the most carefully constructed dynasties could be torn apart by their own blood, that the sacred principle of patriarchal control over inherited wealth could be challenged and defeated in open court. In the parlors and drawing rooms where old money whispered about security and perpetuity, his name became synonymous with existential threat. If one Vanderbilt could tear at the will of a colossus like the Commodore and emerge victorious, what might other disgruntled heirs do to more vulnerable fortunes? The wealthy families of New York looked at Cornelius Jeremiah and saw a contagion, a revolutionary virus that threatened the very foundations of dynastic succession. Invitations that had once arrived sporadically now ceased altogether with the finality of death. The same hostesses who had once prided themselves on inviting that scandalous Vanderbilt now treated his very existence as something improper to mention in polite company. He was no longer a curiosity to be displayed. He was a cautionary tale to be avoided. The transformation was complete. He had evolved from pathetic to dangerous, from amusing to alarming, and the aristocracy knew exactly how to neutralize such threats through systematic exclusion that was more effective than any physical barrier. Into this vacuum of family and society stepped the inevitable parasites, drawn by the scent of his newfound wealth with the unerring instinct of carrion birds. His so-called friends revealed themselves with brutal clarity as sycophants of the most transparent variety, professional companions whose affection was calibrated precisely to the size of his bank account. They would arrive at his suite at the Glenham with congratulations that felt like mockery, praising his courage and challenging the dynasty while calculating how much they could extract before his resources dried up. They drank his imported champagne, smoked his Cuban cigars, borrowed money with promises to repay that both parties understood were elaborate fictions, and departed the moment he showed reluctance to finance their latest schemes. These creatures flattered him with compliments that tasted like ash, their laughter timed to his moods, their predatory patience evident in the way they waited for him to open his wallet. He had traded the genuine hostility of his family for the counterfeit affection of parasites, and the exchange left him feeling more isolated than ever. In a desperate attempt to find meaning or perhaps simply distraction from the emptiness that consumed his days, Jeremiah embarked on an extended European journey, seeking the miracle cures for his epilepsy that had always eluded American medicine. He consulted with specialists in the great spas of Germany and the clinics of France, visiting physicians who took his money with professional courtesy and offered the same useless platitudes he had heard for decades. The treatments were elaborate and expensive: electrical apparatuses, mineral baths, dietary regimens that promised to rebalance his humors, but his condition remained as unpredictable and humiliating as ever. The grand boulevards of Paris, lined with glittering shops and cafes humming with elegant conversation, seemed like stage sets erected for someone else's life. The museums of London, filled with relics of empires long dead, echoed too closely his own private history of ambition and ruin. But travel offered no escape from the fundamental problem: himself. He found only boredom in the treasures of the Louvre and loneliness in the crowds of Piccadilly Circus. The seizures continued with their cruel unpredictability, physical reminders that no amount of money could purchase a new body or rewrite the genetic code that had marked him as defective in his father's eyes. He returned to New York seeking purpose, perhaps imagining he could transform himself into a philanthropist or patron of the arts, but found only the same yawning void that had driven him to Europe in the first place. He lacked the training or temperament for business, having been systematically excluded from it his entire life. He had no wife or children to build a future for, no cause to champion, no legacy to construct. The settlement money, which should have been his salvation, became his torment, a daily reminder that he had won everything he thought he wanted and discovered it was nothing he actually needed. Every luxury he purchased felt like a mockery. Every dollar spent a confirmation that the hole inside him was too deep to be filled with material possessions. The Glenham Hotel, once his headquarters in the campaign for justice, transformed through the lens of his victory into something far more sinister. The suite that had once buzzed with the frantic energy of legal strategy and desperate hope now echoed with the hollow silence of a battle won but a war lost. The room ceased to be a refuge and became a gilded prison, its velvet drapes and mahogany furniture serving as the bars of a cage built from his own success. He paced the expensive carpets until they wore thin, a caged animal in a zoo of his own making, surrounded by the physical evidence of his triumph: fine clothes that hung unworn in wardrobes, imported wines that turned to vinegar in their bottles, expensive cigars that crumbled to dust in there, humidors, all of it serving only to highlight the spiritual vacuum at the center of his existence. The psychological descent was slow, quiet, and terrifyingly absolute, marked by the kind of gradual erosion that transforms mountains into valleys over geological time. The fiery reds of conflict that had colored his life during the trial, the anger, the determination, the sense of righteous purpose, faded into the cold, monochromatic blues of isolation. The debris of his decline accumulated with archaeological precision. Empty champagne bottles lined up like silent sentinels on the sideboard, their expensive labels proclaiming vintages consumed in solitude, medicine vials cluttering the nightstand in ever-increasing quantities, laudanum for pain, morphine for the despair, bromide for the seizures, alcohol for the hours when the medications failed to provide sufficient oblivion. Letters from the few remaining relatives who tried to maintain contact, mostly distant cousins seeking handouts or perfunctory inquiries disguised as family concern, piled up unopened on his writing desk, their seals unbroken because he already knew what they contained. They were not written to him as a person, but to him as a potential source of funds or a family obligation to be discharged with minimum effort. He preferred them as sealed envelopes, their pious hypocrisies safely contained in paper, rather than face the confirmation that even his most distant relations viewed him primarily as a problem to be managed rather than a human being to be loved. He began to withdraw even from his sycophantic companions, spending days at a time locked in his suite, medicating his seizures and his despair with increasing quantities of chemicals that promised oblivion but delivered only temporary numbness, followed by mornings of crushing awareness. The hotel staff learned to check on him regularly, entering quietly with master keys to help him back to bed when they found him collapsed on the floor after seizures, saying nothing about what they witnessed because discretion was part of the service they provided to long-term residents who paid their bills promptly and caused no public disturbances. The tragedy was compounded by a realization that struck him with the force of physical violence. His struggle against his family had been the only thing holding his identity together. For 30 years, he had been the son who was wronged, the fighter, the rebel against Dynasty. That narrative had given him a role to play, a villain to fight, a grail to seek. The conflict had provided structure to his days, purpose to his schemes, meaning to his suffering. Without the struggle, he was just a middle-aged epileptic with a bad reputation and a lot of money. The victory had stripped him of his defining purpose, leaving him adrift in a sea of meaningless luxury. He had spent so long shouting to be heard that he had never considered what he would say if anyone actually listened. Now that the silence had finally fallen, he found he had no voice left, no message to deliver, no reason to continue the performance of existence. He realized with devastating clarity that he had been fighting for his father's love, not his father's money, and that the money was a poor substitute for the one thing that had been permanently denied him. The settlement was not a victory. It was a receipt for a transaction in which he had sold his peace of mind for cash, his identity for vindication, his future for the hollow satisfaction of proving he had been wronged. The emotional ledger remained awash in red ink that no financial settlement could balance. By April 1882, 3 years after his courthouse triumph, the man who had spent his life fighting for recognition found himself in the deafening quiet of absolute solitude. The check had cleared long ago. The lawyers had been paid. The newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals. The Vanderbilt name continued to gleam brighter than ever in the public imagination, associated with opulence, power, and seemingly effortless supremacy. But it appeared in print only beside his brother's accomplishments, never his own. He had become a ghost in his own life, haunting the corridors of the Glenham Hotel, a wealthy man with nowhere to go and no one to be. His soul was bankrupt, overdrawn on purpose and meaning, carrying debts that no amount of money could discharge. In the days leading up to April 2nd, his behavior became marked by the kind of eerie calm that often precedes final decisions. He settled small debts with unusual promptness, organized his papers with uncharacteristic care, and spoke to his companion, George Terry, with a strange, detached wistfulness about being tired of life. The tremor in his hands grew more pronounced, whether from his neurological condition or from the increasing doses of laudanum required to quiet his mind. He looked older than his 51 years, worn down by decades of fighting battles that had no winners, only survivors and casualties. The medicine vials multiplied on his nightstand like a pharmaceutical garden of forgetfulness, each one representing another failed attempt to chemically erase the consciousness that had become unbearable. He was self-medicating not a disease, but an existence, trying to find the precise combination of substances that would allow him to sleep without dreaming, to wake without remembering, to exist without feeling. The hotel doctor visited occasionally, prescribed more of the same, and departed with the professional discretion that expensive establishments provide to residents who pay their bills and cause no public disturbances. And in room 35 of the Glenham Hotel, as March turned to April and the city outside prepared for spring, as the morning sun tried to push through heavy curtains that had remained drawn for days, Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt prepared to balance the books one final time. He understood now, with terrible clarity, that there was only one way to truly escape the shadow of the dynasty, only one way to resign from the exhausting job of being the black sheep, only one door that remained unlocked in the golden cage of his victory. The settlement had given him everything except what mattered. The money had purchased every comfort except peace. The vindication had proven every grievance except the one that counted, that he had deserved to be loved simply for existing, not for achieving, not for conforming, not for being someone other than who he was. The revolver on the nightstand offered the only settlement that would truly be final, the only inheritance that could not be contested, the only victory that would not turn to ash in his mouth. The golden cage was unlocked, but the bird had forgotten how to fly. The only exit left was the one that led into the dark, and on that Sunday morning, with less than $20 in his pocket, but $400,000 in his account, Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt would finally find the peace that all his father's money could never buy. April 2nd, 1882. Room 35. The revolver's echo faded with startling swiftness into the thick carpeting and heavy drapes, then dissipated entirely into the indifferent noise of a Manhattan Sunday morning. Outside the Glenham Hotel, carriages continued their rhythmic procession down Fifth Avenue. Church bells summoned the faithful to morning services, and the great machinery of commerce prepared for another week of relentless accumulation. The death of Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt was not a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the city. It was merely a punctuation mark, the final period on a sentence that had been rambling toward silence for 50 years. By the time the maid's scream brought hotel staff rushing down the corridors, by the time the police arrived with their notebooks and professional detachment, the world had already moved past him with the amnesia that allows great cities to constantly reinvent themselves without being paralyzed by accumulated tragedy. His funeral, held 3 days later at the Church of the Strangers on Mercer Street, was a masterpiece of minimalist obligation that spoke volumes through its emptiness. The sanctuary, built to accommodate hundreds of mourners, echoed with a hollowness that was more eloquent than any eulogy could have been. Fewer than a dozen people attended, a grim collection consisting primarily of his companion George Terry, a few hotel staff who had witnessed his final decline, some distant acquaintances drawn by morbid curiosity, and perhaps one or two of the sycophants who had attached themselves to his wealth. And now came to confirm that their source of income had truly dried up. His brother William Henry Vanderbilt, the man who controlled more wealth than any single human being in the world at that moment, did not come. He sent no flowers, no representatives, no acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum required by social convention. Even in death, the dynasty maintained its quarantine around the black sheep, delivering a final, thundering statement of rejection that echoed louder than any words could have managed. The minister, who had never met the deceased, delivered generic platitudes about God's mercy and the mysteries of the human heart, carefully avoiding any specific details about Jeremiah's life that might prove awkward or controversial. No one rose to speak personal memories. No one wept with genuine grief. The ceremony felt less like a funeral than an administrative procedure, the final step in removing an inconvenient name from the family ledger. The service was brief, perfunctory, designed to discharge a social obligation rather than honor a human being who had spent 51 years desperately seeking acknowledgement from those who shared his blood. The newspapers, which had devoted columns to his trial and feasted on his scandals for years, published brief obituaries that treated his death as a minor curiosity rather than a human tragedy. Cornelius J. Vanderbilt, son of the late Commodore, died by his own hand Sunday morning at the Glenham Hotel, read the typical notice, followed by a few sentences summarizing his eccentric life and unfortunate affliction. There was no analysis of what his death meant, no reflection on the human cost of dynastic ambition, no suggestion that perhaps the richest family in America bore some responsibility for the destruction of one of its own. Within a week, even these brief mentions ceased, and the city's attention moved on to fresher scandals with the relentless churn that characterizes urban existence. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, who had spent his entire life fighting to be seen, vanished from public consciousness as completely as if he had never existed. The dynasty he was born into did what it did best, with the same ruthless efficiency it applied to railway schedules and stock mergers. It erased him. In the official Vanderbilt genealogies compiled by family historians, his entry became minimal, a name and dates with no elaboration, no stories, no acknowledgement of the legal battle that had threatened to tear the family apart. In the biographies of the Commodore and William Henry that would be published in subsequent decades, he appears as a footnote if he appears at all, dismissed in a sentence or two as the troubled second son, whose problems were attributed to his medical condition rather than to any failure of familial love or responsibility. The Vanderbilt narrative, carefully curated by descendants and sympathetic historians, became a story of triumph, vision, and American exceptionalism. There was no room in that narrative for the son who died alone in a hotel room with a revolver in his hand. Today, more than a century and 4 decades after that April morning, the Vanderbilt name endures with the permanence of stone and steel, woven into the very fabric of American identity. It lives in the Beaux Arts grandeur of Grand Central Terminal, where millions of commuters pass beneath the celestial ceiling without knowing the name of the family that built it, their footsteps echoing through marble halls that serve as an unconscious temple to transportation and modernity. It lives in the prestigious corridors of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where thousands of students walk across manicured lawns and through Gothic buildings constructed with family money, pursuing educations funded by the surplus of an empire built on iron rails and steamship smoke. It lives in the gilded mansions of Newport, the Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, that stand as American palaces, drawing tourists by the hundreds of thousands who photograph gold-leaf ceilings and imported marble staircases as if they were natural wonders rather than monuments to wealth. Concentration. These places bear the Vanderbilt name like a royal crest, suggesting continuity, solidity, legacy built to last. They present a version of the dynasty that would have pleased the Commodore's vanity, disciplined, powerful, unified, triumphant over all obstacles. But if you know where to look, if you linger in the forgotten corners and empty spaces that tourists rush past in their eagerness to see the next gilded ballroom, you can find traces of the story the dynasty worked so hard to erase. The monuments tell only half the tale, the half that fits comfortably into the mythology of American success. But Cornelius Jeremiah's story asks the question that every dynasty fears, the question that haunts the empty spaces between the marble columns and whispers through the silent corners of the great estates. What happens when the golden child becomes the black sheep? What happens to the human debris created by the construction of these great fortunes? His tragedy was not epilepsy, though that condition marked him as defective in an age that confused neurological disorder with moral failure. It was not gambling or forgery, though those were the symptoms of his desperation rather than its cause. His fundamental tragedy was simpler and more cruel. He was born into a family that confused wealth with worth, power with love, legacy with humanity. He was a man who needed compassion in a family that dealt only in conquest. He was a son who needed patience in a dynasty that valued only speed and efficiency. He was a human being who needed to be seen and accepted in a world that only valued what could be counted, weighed, and converted into profit. The Commodore looked at his second son and saw a bad investment, a depreciating asset to be written off with the same cold calculation he applied to failing railroad lines. He never understood that a son is not a stock portfolio, that family is not a business enterprise, that the rules of the marketplace, where the weak are devoured by the strong, are monstrous when applied to one's own flesh and blood. In the end, the Commodore built an empire that could span a continent, laying iron rails across mountains and deserts, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific through sheer force of will and ruthless elimination of competition. He mastered markets and monopolies with the precision of a chess grandmaster, manipulated stock prices and legislative votes with the casual ease of a puppeteer pulling strings, and accumulated wealth that rivaled the treasuries of European monarchies. He was a titan, a colossus, a man who bent the arc of American history through the exercise of individual will. But he could not bridge the gap between himself and his second son, could not traverse the emotional distance that separated them, despite sharing the same blood, the same name, the same Manhattan Island. He mastered the complex mathematics of compound interest and rate wars and stock manipulation, but he never learned the simple arithmetic of mercy, that some inheritances cannot be measured in dollars, that some debts can only be paid in compassion, that the most important legacy a father leaves is not written in his will, but carved into his children's memories of whether they were loved. The Commodore understood every nuance of commercial warfare, but the grammar of human connection eluded him completely. He could calculate to the penny the value of every asset in his empire, but he never learned to calculate the cost of withholding love from a child who desperately needed it. The irony would have appealed to Jeremiah's bitter sense of humor. In death, he achieved the proximity to his father that was denied him in life. In the Vanderbilt Mausoleum on Staten Island, where the family's dead rest in Gothic splendor beneath stained glass and carved stone, Cornelius Jeremiah finally lies near the father, who spent a lifetime rejecting him. They are united in death by the only force that could overcome the Commodore's iron will, time itself, which reduces all human dramas to names on marble, all passionate conflicts to dates on monuments, all elaborate hatreds to the democratic silence of the grave. Death, the great equalizer, forced the reunion that life never permitted. The mausoleum makes no distinction between the favored heir and the black sheep, between the son who built the empire and the son who tried to tear it down. In the silence of that tomb, the arguments about money and madness, about forgery and failure, have finally ceased. The father can no longer shout his disapproval. The son can no longer plead for recognition. They are simply bones sharing the same earth, their lifelong conflict resolved by the erosion of biological existence, united at last by the only force more powerful than dynastic cruelty, mortality's democracy. The universal truth that emerges from Cornelius Jeremiah's tragedy cuts against the grain of every age's mythology of self-made success, that building an empire means nothing if you destroy your family in the process, that all the wealth in the world cannot compensate for the absence of love, that the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but how you treat the people who depend on you for their sense of worth and belonging. His story serves as a reminder that behind every great fortune lies not just a crime, as Balzac suggested, but often a tragedy, that for every William Henry who inherits the kingdom, there is a Cornelius Jeremiah who inherits the exile, and that the true cost of dynastic ambition is often paid by those least able to afford it. Room 35 of the Glenham Hotel no longer exists. The building was demolished decades ago, its bricks repurposed, its corridors erased from the city's memory, replaced by modern structures in a metropolis that cannibalizes its own history with voracious appetite. The street has changed its face a dozen times. Electric streetcars replacing horses, automobiles replacing streetcars, glass towers rising where gas lamps once cast their unsteady glow. No plaque marks the place where an heir decided he could no longer endure his inheritance. The city has forgotten, as cities always do, moving forward with the amnesia that allows urban centers to constantly reinvent themselves without being paralyzed by the weight of accumulated tragedy. But somewhere in the margins of history, in the footnotes of genealogies and the dusty records of surrogate courts, in the brief mentions that have been digitized but rarely read, Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt still sits on the edge of that bed in room 35. He is 51 years old and exhausted by the effort of existing. The morning light filtering through heavy curtains is gray and weak. The sounds of the city are muffled by velvet drapes that have absorbed decades of whispered confessions and desperate schemes. His hands tremble, whether from his neurological condition or from the enormity of what he is about to do, as they lift the revolver, feeling its cold weight, its mechanical indifference to human suffering. In this frozen moment before the final act, he asks the question that every forgotten heir, every rejected child, every person who has spent their life seeking acknowledgement from those who refuse to give it, eventually asks in the silence of their desperation, "Was I ever real to you? Did I matter beyond the inconvenience I represented? Would you have loved me if I had been different? Or was the problem not my flaws but simply my existence? Was there ever a version of myself that could have earned your approval? Or was I doomed from the moment I drew breath to be the family failure, the cautionary tale, the son who proved that even the mightiest bloodlines can produce defective offspring?" The Dynasty never answered these questions during his lifetime, responding only with silence, institutionalization, disinheritance, and the systematic erasure of his personhood. They answered with money when forced to by courts, with lawyers when threatened by scandal, with asylums when embarrassed by seizures, but never with the simple words that might have changed everything. You are enough, even as you are. Perhaps that silence was answer enough, a clear statement that in the calculus of dynasty, individual suffering is an acceptable cost of maintaining the empire's coherence and reputation, that some lives are rounding errors destined to be erased so the final sum remains perfect. The check had cleared long ago, but his soul remained bankrupt, overdrawn on purpose and meaning, carrying debts that no amount of money could discharge. As the trigger clicks in the historical imagination, we are left with the uncomfortable truth that the greatest poverty of all is to be unloved in a room full of gold, to die rich in everything except what mattered most. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt's legacy is not the $400,000 he won in settlement, which evaporated within 3 years. His legacy is the question he forces us to confront across the centuries. In building our empires, how many of our own do we destroy? And when the monuments crumble and the fortunes disperse, what will remain except the memory of whether we loved each other or whether we merely used each other in service of ambitions that meant nothing in the end?